So in this talk, we want to address what I think of as the crux of this entire course, and that is evolution. So many people, much smarter than me, have said that biology cannot be viewed except through the lens of evolution. There is no biology that you cannot look at except through the lens of evolution. And evolution, very simple idea, the idea that there is genetic change in populations over time. And from that simple idea, we're going to see it has far-reaching and complex results. Right? So we've been talking about genetics. We're talking about this idea that meiosis mixes up the genes that you have, creates unique combinations of alleles, but it doesn't create new alleles. Right? All those alleles are coming from mutations, right? Changes in the DNA from mutagens, whether they be physical or chemical or what have you. Our DNA is changing, and that creates new alleles. Why is it so important to maintain genetic variation? It's about survival of the species. And we're going to address these ideas as we move through evolution and its details. So evolution, the father of evolution, is considered to be Charles Darwin. And his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection was kind of the bomb on the world that kind of released this idea. Now, he didn't just come up with this overnight. Rather, it was a lifetime of study, and which included his trip around the world. And you'll often hear then the Galapagos Islands associated with Darwin. And it was the species that he observed at these islands that had a profound impact on him. And specifically, you'll hear of Darwin's finches. The idea that there was some early population of finches that were blown off the South American coast to these very isolated islands, and then from that population descended many different types of finches, each different, each adapted to its particular source of food, whether they be insects or grubs or fruit, but all from the same parents, that they quote-unquote evolved. The differences that we see in people are all the result of mutation, of genetic diversity. And it's super important to maintain that diversity, right? Diversity means survival. And so like we said, we have meiosis as a mechanism to keep mixing new alleles. We have mutation that suggests that new combinations, new sequences of DNA are being introduced into the universal gene pool, such that this process, taken back to its core, suggests that all life is related. All life evolved from some population of earliest organisms, right? That there is a great to many, many, many numbers grandfather, grandmother that we possess that is far beyond human, that is the ancestor to both plants and animals, right? So these are big thoughts and big ideas, but we can look at the mechanism and see that this makes a lot of sense, right? Now, again, evolution is going to be genetic change in a population over generations or over time. And that is an idea that I want to stress because individuals do not evolve. Populations evolve. Individuals can acclimate, and that is to a certain extent what we talk about as a physiological level. So it's a gradual physiological adjustment of an organism to a new environment. Right? Let's say you move to Hawaii, where it's warmer all the time. All of a sudden, 80 degrees becomes very comfortable. Whereas if you live in Alaska, 50 degrees is comfortable. But you can move and adjust, right? You acclimate. You don't evolve. Populations evolve. Genetic change over time. So let's start with, and I don't often do this, but let's start with a big slide of definitions. And we're going to go over these terms, and then we're going to use them. And by using them, we're going to get them in our head and become more and more familiar with them. Evolution, genetic change in a population over time. All right? And as we go through examples, we're going to see that we see genetic change and be like, boom, that's evolution occurring. Adaptation. So that's a trait that provides an advantage to an individual in a specific environment. If my beak is of a certain shape that it allows me to catch grubs easier than to catch insects or eat fruit, I have an advantage when I go after grubs. That is a specific environment, and that is an adaptation. Natural selection is going to be kind of the mechanism of evolution, how differential reproductive success based on different phenotypes interacting with the environment. So those adaptations allowing me the beak that allows me to get more food. Having more food means more resources, means I can have more babies, means I can pass my genes on to a greater extent to the next generation. And the genetic composition of the population changes. All right, so natural selection, differential reproductive success based on your interaction with the environment. Okay, we're going to call that selective pressure. Right? We'll get there. Allele frequency, the percentage one allele represents of the total number of alleles in a population. Right, so this is a way to measure now evolution. If we see a gene that confers an advantage, and we see that the frequency of that gene go up in a population, more and more individuals have it, that is the direction that evolution is going. Allele frequency is going up, the population is evolving. And the gene pool is then the total collection of all alleles in a population at any given time. And so based on evolution, that should be in flux, changing up and down as we change, as we respond on a population level, evolutionarily, to a changing environment. And the point here is that the environment is rarely static. We'll see that there are some environments that are relatively static and we see stabilization occur. But in general, the environment is changing, and with that change, diversity equals survival. All right, let's use this very heavy-handed example of evolution to kind of illustrate some of these concepts. So at the top of the page, you have a bunch of beetles, and we can see one of the chromosomes on those beetles. And they represent, a percentage of the population. 20% of the population is each beetle. And 80% of that population then has the green gene, and 20% has the red gene. And that's fine. Now, the thing about beetles is they like to eat plants, and oftentimes they like to eat the plants that we are growing for food. And so when we experience competition for food, we try to eliminate that competition. So we're going to spray insecticide now all over these fields and try to kill the bugs. Well, that works sometimes. Now, because of the genetic variation in this population, and it just so happens by random chance that the red gene confers resistance to the insecticide. All of a sudden, those beetles with the red gene, 20% of the population, look around, and all beetles that had the green gene are gone. Now, that is less competition for them. They eat, not being stopped by the insecticide, and reproduce. Now, because they have the red gene, and only the red gene in this case, they pass it on to their children. All of a sudden now, 100% of the population is red gene. So you go from 20% red, 80% green, to 100% red. The allele frequency has changed significantly of the red gene. You have an evolving population, genetic change over time, through generations, right? This is evolution. Natural selection has said that I have differential reproductive success. It is difficult to reproduce if you're dead, right? And so in this case, it's the most extreme case of differential reproductive success because only those with the red gene can reproduce. The green gene doesn't get passed on at all because they're dead, right? So that being said, that is the most simple, a very simple example of evolution, right? So selective pressure in this case is the insecticide. So that is the environmental factor that says you with this genotype and hence phenotype will have more babies than you who don't have that phenotype. Spraying the insecticide changes the environment and we change who has more babies. So this is where the idea of evolution comes in, that people talk about the survival of the fittest. And I want to be very, very clear here that there are certain stereotypical images that arise in your mind when you hear that phrase. And I want you to think about that for a second. When I say survival of the fittest, what examples come to your mind immediately? most people think about stronger, faster, better hunter, more violent, more able to combat. And that's not at all necessary. So really, survival of the fittest, when we talk about fit, we don't mean stronger, faster, more aggressive unless that fits the environment. We mean fit means most fitted to the current environment, the most appropriate to the current environment. So it's really survival of the most appropriate. For example, I forgot to tell you that red gene, it makes these beetles, as compared to the beetles with the green genes, slower. Their exoskeletons are weaker. They can't eat as fast. All in all, you would consider them not as fit, quote unquote. But as soon as that environment changes, all of a sudden, who's fit now? The red beetles are the new standard. The red beetles are alive, where the green beetles are dead. It doesn't matter how fast or strong or tough they were. The new environment full of insecticides says if you have the red gene, you get to eat. You can't be outcompeted by the green gene because the green gene is dead. Does that make sense? So survival of the fittest is survival of the most appropriate, right? Now, the other thing that I want to mention in this kind of intro talk about evolution is the timescales at which evolution works. And in general, especially when we think of things with longer lifespans, it takes many, many, many years of natural selection, and an environment changes relatively slowly. Environment changes on geologic timescales, right? In general, and we maybe see some exceptions now as we go through global climate change. But the geologic timescale is very, very big. So again, people make the argument, well, I don't understand, or I can't conceive of how these little changes would create something as complicated as a human being, or as complicated as an eyeball, or as complicated as whatever. And in fact, if you give something enough time, it'll happen. Billions of years, right? So the planet is 4.6 billion years old, and life arose around 3.8 billion years ago. Now, if I took this clock, this history of the planet, and converted it into a 24-hour clock, just to give you some kind of something you can wrap your brain around, we can put historic events on that 24-hour clock. And so if the Earth forms at midnight 4.6 billion years ago, then life evolved, first appeared on Earth about 4:10 in the morning, 4:10 a.m. Right? So for 4 hours of that day, there was no life at all. The Earth is cooling, geological chemistry is going on, all kinds of crazy stuff. Now, we don't see anything that looks like a eukaryotic cell until 5:42 p.m. So more than half the day has gone by with nothing but prokaryotic life. So at 5:42 p.m., about 1.2 billion years ago, some people put that at 2 billion years ago, but we'll go with 1.2 billion years ago. It's 5:42 p.m. Eukaryotes evolve. Plants move onto the land at 9:46 p.m. Whoa, it's into the evening, well into the evening. It's about 500 million years ago. Homo sapiens, our species, in its modern form, which we're going to clock around 165, maybe 200,000 years ago, it's 11:59, 56.9 seconds. Right? So that's 3.1 seconds before midnight. And if you look at the oldest civilization, about 10,000 years or so, it's 0.2 seconds to midnight. So our whole history of human civilization is less than the blink of an eye. We are just a mote of sand when we talk about a geological timescale. And so our brains in our everyday world aren't built to think about numbers this big. So to say, oh, I don't believe or I don't understand how evolution could work because these time frames aren't something that you can really wrap your brain around. But you can do the math, and that adds up. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, which is kind of cool, is a Lamarck. So Lamarck was, in the early 1800s, it was one of the people that Darwin would certainly read about as he was forming his theory. But Lamarck suggested that there was a different mechanism to the appearance of species, different kinds of life. And his idea was that small small changes accumulated over time. And those changes then could be passed on to their progeny, their children. And so the giraffe, Lamarck's giraffe is kind of the classic example, that the original ancestor of the giraffe was short-necked. And because it was reaching its neck up to eat, that leaves were good to eat, it would stretch its neck all day long and get a longer neck. And by the time it had babies, its neck was longer because it had stretched out so long, so its babies had longer necks. And hence its babies with longer necks could stretch their necks out and reach higher leaves yet, and stretch their necks and have babies with longer necks yet. And so what they did during their life, Lamarck suggested, was passed on to the next generation. Where in fact Darwin's idea is that the genetic variation that is produced through sexual reproduction and natural mutation is selected for by those that are most appropriate. So there's more randomness to it. But given enough time and enough randomness, things come up with that you never would have thought of, or activities or behaviors that you never would have engaged in to change your morphology. So Lamarck was incorrect. Now, I'm going to say it as a caveat, and you don't have to know it for this class, but as you go further on, especially if you go on to molecular biology, what we're learning is that Lamarck wasn't completely incorrect. So there are things that you can do now that we're learning that are experiences that you can have, severe drought, stress, disease, other kinds of things that can change your DNA in a way that you will pass that on to your children. So again, this class is just an introduction. It's opportunity, a stepping stone to read and learn deeply about any of these topics in biology.